Hello, my name is Peter Tush. I'm the Curator of Education here at the Dali Museum, and I'm here with students from Osceola High School, and we are talking about the new Dali Artmobile that's going to be coming out in Pinellas County. This is going to be focusing on math, science, and art, so basically a stream presentation trying to connect our collection with these ideas beyond just art. And I'm going to be taking you to some very specific paintings that will be incorporated into the Artmobile and giving you a little bit of insight into how Dali perceived his artwork in relation to these other disciplines. We're going to begin with this painting. It's a self-portrait from 1919. Dali was about 14 to 15 years old when he completed this work. It's definitely in the style of Gauguin and other Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. He was very young, but very taken with that movement and the kind of sense of life that almost seized through the oil painting that he was seeing at this time. And so he taught himself how to paint in this style. Impressionism is basically celebrated as an immediate response by artists trying to get away from the traditional approach to subject matter. And so they were really interested in the science of the way the eye mixes color as it perceives light bouncing off the subject. And Dali was certainly aware of some of these ideas, but one thing that's interesting is that most Impressionists would approach their subject so that they would do it very quickly, they would do very spontaneously, and if the light effects would change, they would quickly change to another canvas. Dali has chosen a very deliberately non-Impressionist approach. He was very fascinated, I think, by this idea, particularly from one of Van Gogh's paintings of an interior space where you can see a variety of paintings by the artist around the wall, making it seem very exotic, very bohemian. And in order to capture himself painting in profile, he actually set up 3 different mirrors that he was wanting to use in order to see himself watching himself from the side, so that he was able to place himself right in front of the opening of the window, has this beautiful bay outside, there's a sense of the aura, sort of the idea of the yearning beyond the door, but he did it in a very sort of scientific fashion, which would be very, very different from the way that an Impressionist painter would have chosen to approach the subject. So he was still a very young artist, but already by this time he's interested in how science and the visual arts are interacting with one another. A number of different topics that are worth mentioning about this painting. The first is that it's an Impressionist painting, and Dali is working with a contrasting of colors between the reds and the blues, so a very cool contrast with the bright red warm colors. And that's the way that he's able to establish the interior and exterior contrast, so that as you're looking at the painting, the warm colors of the sky outside draws your eye past the walls, which he's decorated by several examples of his own paintings. You can also see that the way he's approached the canvas, he's used a very loose and thick brushstroke. Again, inspired by the Impressionists and also Van Gogh. And there's something about it that's very tactile, it's very sensuous. It's something that he was particularly drawn to and wanted to celebrate and kind of revel in. So he's exploring this, he's still very young, he hasn't really developed a particular style, so he's trying to understand the styles of those who went before him. There's also the sense that he's working in this particular optical fashion with these 3 mirrors, partially as a response to his enthusiasm for the early kinds of toys that were very popular at the turn of the century, which was part of his generation growing up with. Zoetropes, opticons, different types of toys that had to do with visual imagery and mirrors, and creating something that was very exciting, like almost pre-Disney as a form of entertainment. And so he's getting some of those concepts directly from things that he was exposed to as a very young child. And there's also something that's unusual about this. When we think of Dali, we often think of the large canvases, for example, the Toreador, which is going to be in the Artmobile. This is a relatively small canvas in contrast to that. And Dali was somebody who, when he started, certainly as all artists did, started with a very reasonable or scale piece to work with. And as his confidence grew, so did his ambition towards using larger and smaller canvases. He would later also go in the opposite direction and do some extremely exquisite tiny miniatures. But at this point, you get that sense of a very controllable scale that he's trying to create this very intimate portrait of himself in front of this opening. And the very last question would be concerning the idea of composition. You know, why did Dali choose to present himself in this way? A young man wearing this white shirt, seemingly very much in a kind of active motion, creating a very different scaled image on his easel in front of this open door. And this really has to do with the influence of art from the 19th century. He saw a number of pieces related to the idea of symbolism and the idea of a kind of yearning to something better in the beyond. And so for Dali, always that had to do with interior and exterior, using either doors or windows to create that sense of some sort of voyage or something greater beyond the interior space, something beyond the human space, almost a kind of spiritual sensibility. This is The Weaning of Furniture Nutrition. It's from 1936, so at this point Dali was 32 years old, right in the middle of the time when he was a surrealist. This is really the height of the period that he's most celebrated for. And it's a painting that captures perfectly this idea of a kind of photorealism, and almost a moment where it seems very much like a photograph that's been hand tinted. And yet when you look at the composition, you suddenly realize right in the very center of it, there's something that's completely impossible. And what Dali's trying to do is use his ability as a painter to convince us of the reality of something that's completely and totally impossible. So at this point, he's spending a lot of time reflecting on the writings of Sigmund Freud and the idea of celebrating dreams, celebrating dream imagery, trying to create something that seems completely impossible and yet presented in such a way that it convinces us of the reality. And the story we have here relates to the title. So the title is The Weaning of Furniture Nutrition, and the main focus there, the main idea is the verb to wean. When basically there's a wet nurse or somebody who's there when you're an infant, they are the ones responsible for weaning you away from your mother. Dali is celebrating the woman who's here in the middle of the canvas. This is the woman who was his nurse. It was Lucia. She was actually his nanny, and she was the one responsible for raising him as a child, essentially weaning him away from his mother. And so by the time Dali's painting this, she's become an old woman. And he's living in a very different community. He grew up in Cadaqués, well, he grew up in Cadaqués and Figueres, but at this point he's living in Port Legat on the Mediterranean coast. And every day he goes out, and when the fishermen are out with their nets, the women would remain back on the beach, and they would actually mend the fishing nets that had been damaged the week before. And so Dali's looking at these women mending fishing nets, and he's remembering Lucia. So he has a particular memory in his mind. And he starts to think about how the way that she weaned him away from his mother is the way that he is remembering her and now sort of visualizing her as one of these net mending women. So Lucia has transformed metamorphically from being a nanny to now being a net mender. And she's seated here on the beach. She's become old. And Dali has, in his mind, also remembered that the table, the chest of drawers that he had in his bedroom was always associated in his mind with her. It's like one memory, the object of furniture and her presence. And so what he's done is he's basically used the idea of jigsaw puzzle pieces, and he's pulled out from her body a chest of drawers that in his mind is sort of part of the same memory. But he's made it explicit by showing how this piece of furniture, which is inanimate, can fit perfectly into the opening inside of his nanny's body, so that they are one and the same, but it's as if it's been weaned out from her. It's been pulled out from her. And then there's even a smaller table that has a bottle of medicine, which was also something that Dali was always associating with his nanny. So the three things are almost like either jigsaw puzzle pieces or like stacking dolls, like Russian stacking dolls, that all fit together, seems completely impossible, and yet it's captured with this great realism. And then the final thing is Dali is aware of the fact that at this point she's become quite elderly, she's become weak, and what he chooses to do is use a crutch, which basically we use to support ourselves when we start to get weaker moving our legs, but instead he's thinking that if there's no crutch there, she would collapse. And so it's like this prop for her old age, this kind of a symbol, I suppose, of solace, trying to offer some comfort to her as she gets older. And again, everything is presented in this perfectly beautiful, pristine, sort of like hand-tinted photograph of the bay in front of his studio in Port Legat. In this painting, there's several concepts that are associated with surrealism that become much more clear. One of them is dislocation. And we've talked about the fact that his nanny was associated with his childhood youth in a different city. So the fact that he's taken this person that he associates with one environment and placed her in this other environment would be a perfect example of dislocation. There's also the sense of juxtaposition. This is where you take two things that don't seem to go together and you place them in conjunction with one another, creating a new idea. And I think you could certainly say that putting the crutch in the middle of the body is a type of juxtaposition where you would never expect to see a crutch inside of somebody's body or a hole inside of that body, and yet it creates this incredibly momentary enigma where you look at the person and something about it seems very strange and startling, and yet at the same time is presented very, very much like a photograph of that idea. This also connects with one of the other paintings that's going to be part of the Artmobile. It connects with the Hallucinogenic Toreador, where you'll see several of the Venuses turned away from us actually start to have openings in their body, which is a reference back to this particular painting and that very surreal, uncanny idea of a body suddenly having a hole inside of it. One of the other surrealist concepts that you can also observe in this painting is the idea of transformation, where a body suddenly changes and becomes something quite different and alien from what we had originally thought of it. So the idea of this development of an opening inside of the body is a transformation of something familiar into something very strange and unsettling. And at the same time, the way that Dali has presented it, it's not scary. It's not supposed to contain that sense of fear, but rather the sense of a kind of unusual way to talk about sadness and passing of time and the age of his nanny as she's approaching her old age. So it's a rather sentimental way to deal with metamorphosis and transformation in this particular composition. This is a painting called Old Age, Adolescence, and Infancy, or the Three Ages. It's from 1940. At the moment, we have this painting on loan, so that's why we were talking about the poster, but nevertheless is one of the key images involved with the Artmobile. It is a painting that deals with one of the core concepts of Dali's approach to painting, which is his ability and skill at creating double images. So what we're looking at here initially is a landscape where you'll notice that there's three lighter areas, three areas that our attention is drawn to. And if you start to squint or just start to look at them, you'll realize that essentially there's three busts, and they're placed on this plinth, and each one of these busts is of a face. On the left-hand side, you have the face of an old man, from the nose, the eye, the lips, and the mustache. In the central area, right here, you'll notice that there's two eyes, a nose, and a pair of lips. And then finally, on the far right-hand side, there's part of a head that's defined of this little child, part of the clothing, and then there's one eye and a grinning set of teeth in the middle of it. So you can start to see where Dali's looking at three busts in a particular landscape. But when you get very close, what happens is those images dissolve and disappear. And what you suddenly realize is that you're looking at details of figures standing in a particular position so that their position when seen from a distance actually becomes a completely different composition. So for example, the image of the old man is actually made up of this opening in this brick wall. And there's a woman standing here. And she's looking down, she's holding a basket. Her head is in shadow, and it's wrapped by a cloth, and that becomes the old man's eye. Her elbow projects outwards, and that becomes the nose of the old man. And then she's holding this basket, and the basket has a particular cloth over it, which forms a shadow, which becomes the lips of the old man. And her skirt goes forward in front of the cloth, which becomes his mustache. When you move to the central figure, again, there's that kind of magic transformation, this metamorphic change that happens where you realize you're looking at Dali as a child, wearing the sailor suit, one of the things that he was most fond of from his youth, and he's standing next to his nurse, Lucia, who we've seen also in the Weaning of Furniture Nutrition, and they're looking across the bay of Port Legat, and across the bay, you can see there's these rocks and there's small houses The houses form the eyes of the young man, and her kerchief at the very top forms the nose, and then she has this scarf which is casting a shadow, which creates the formation of the lips. And then finally, when we get over here to the infant, what you'll actually notice is that there's a woman mending a fishing net, turned away from us. The back of her head forms the eye of the young child, and she has a beaded belt across herself, which becomes the grinning lips and the teeth being seen from within those lips. There's a variety of other different details that you'll notice in this painting, but it's this uncanny ability that Dali has to create a completely convincing situation where you see very clearly one set of things, and then those dissolve into a completely different thing without anything being changed. It's just the moment of perception. And so Dali becomes fascinated by the way the mind works and the way the mind is able to perceive certain configurations. There's one final thing that's really fascinating about this painting. This was done right at the end of Dali's period as a surrealist. By this point, he's just about ready to move on. He's no longer associated with the movement, but he's still fascinated by kind of visual sleights of hand, transformations, the way metamorphosis can be around us and we're not even aware of it. Almost like when we look at clouds and we start to see visual images, Dali's proposing that maybe the world is in flux and going through a metamorphic process. Dali was also very fascinated by Sigmund Freud, and one of Sigmund Freud's key ideas is the Oedipus complex, the idea of a father and son rivalry that's classic to almost any male's upbringing, this idea of having to challenge the father. One of the key stories in the Greek mythology that's based on, the Greek story of Oedipus, is the riddle of the Sphinx. One of the key things that Oedipus accomplishes is answering and deciphering what is the riddle of the Sphinx. The Sphinx, which held the city of Thebes under siege, finally had to relent when the riddle was answered. The riddle is, what is it that walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening? And the answer is man, who as a child crawls on all 4s, so over here as an infant, as an adolescent is able to walk upright, and then finally, when moving towards old age, needs a crutch for assistance. And so Dali actually takes that classic Freudian idea of the Oedipus complex and works it into this double image to both be a commentary on himself and also the way that that the world is filled with personal symbolism that all of us can start to almost plug into and discover on our own. Is this a good example of surrealism? It certainly is exactly what Dali was trying to accomplish as a surrealist, because what he's presented for us is an almost dreamlike moment where we are looking at a landscape, we are deciphering certain things that have a very personal significance for Dali, but it's almost like he's pulling the rug out from under us, and he's deliberately trying to force us to re-envision everything that's around us. And I think what he's trying to do is suggest that perhaps the world is always in flux. This idea of metamorphosis is something that for Dali he wants to sustain. He feels is sustained by the world around us, and that we just don't pay attention. We don't stop to actually look and see this happening. And so as a painting representing surrealism, I think this is one of the, the quintessential statements that he has on surrealism. This next painting is Nature Mort Evangelic. The title is very similar to Nature Mort Vivant, and it has to do with the idea of a still life, nature mort. This is a painting that we don't discuss quite as often as some of our other paintings, but in the context of the Artmobile, it makes complete sense because the painting deals with symmetry, it deals with patterning, and it deals with a great attention to detail, which has to do with form and mathematics. So it's a painting that shows basically 5 items on a table. So it's a still life painting. We have a tabletop, 2 loaves of bread, which look very much like large rocks. They're very unusual looking, but very much like the typical bread that Dali would have been familiar with. You have 2 flying fish on either side, and then right in the middle you have a flounder, which is a pentagram shape, a 5-sided form. And what Dali has done here is he's really been obsessed with the particular balance of form between dark and light, and he's tried to use the mathematical principles of this particular form, this 5-sided fish in the center, to also then create a pentagram on the outside of it. And so he's been, at this point, looking at a lot of Leonardo da Vinci. He's been looking at a lot of mathematical studies by Matilda Gica, and he's trying to create these particular forms that resonate in a way that seems very ritualistic, very much controlled in the way it's presented. But again, you have this kind of almost a sense of a miracle about to happen. And it does allude to a Catholic story, which is the feeding of the multitudes, where bread and fish were used to basically feed the 5,000 who had gathered for a particular moment in the life of Christ. So Dali's also touching on Catholicism in relation to mathematics. So it's really almost kind of using different forms from mathematics, very basic forms, in order to create this very rich composition, which also deals with darkness and with light. The sequential patterning that Dali has brought out in this painting, where there is this very specific use of simple forms, but also trying to pull them out in a very balanced and individual way. And so we have 5 items on the table. The 5 items have a certain relationship to one another. This would be item A. Changing from the vertical to the circular would be item B. Going to the pentagonal form would be item C. Returning to the circular would be going back to B again. And then finally, with this vertical image on the other side, you'd be going back to A. So an A, B, C, B, A composition, or A, B, A, B, A. So either way, a sequential patterning would be a very good way to hook in with students in this painting. So here we have a rather small painting, much smaller than some of the works we've looked at so far. This is the Disintegration of the Persistence of Memory. It was painted over a 2-year period, 1952 to 54. And what Dali has done with this work is he's gone back to perhaps the best known painting of his career, The Persistence of Memory from 1931. And what he's trying to do is more or less show you very graphically what's changed in the world around us using this one particular iconic image and completely transforming it to relate to this post-atomic world that suddenly Dali's found himself in. So in 1931, Dali was a surrealist, and the melting watch became the icon for both Dali and surrealism. The original inspiration for that, which always comes up, this idea of a melting watch, the interpretation of it in 1931 was that the melting watch becomes a symbol for the idea that in the dream world, time becomes very fluid and very meaningless. And so a watch no longer needs to behave the way that it does in our daily world. By 1952, Dali is no longer a surrealist, and the world has definitely moved very, very far from that interwar period of 1931. So Dali at this point has defined himself as a nuclear mystical painter. He's interested in science. He's interested in particular in subatomic particles. It seems like dreams are suddenly a part of the reality of science in the 1950s. So what Dali has done is he's taken that original painting, which showed a kind of wasteland with these melting watches, and in this particular rereading of it, suddenly everything is starting to dissolve into subatomic particles. So it's as if the effects of the atomic bomb are now being felt even as far away as Port Legat, where Dali's working. The landscape is dissolved into this series of small particles, but you'll notice that everything is even and harmonious. So the idea is that even disintegrations have a certain particular kind of order or consistency to them on a subatomic level. The watches are all still here. All 3 of the melting watches are still floating in the atmosphere, but suddenly the water has become the skin that seems like you could just pull it away. There's part of the rocks that were part of the original painting that have just drifted off into the atmosphere. And there's 2 additional things that Dali has added to this painting. The first one is this particular fish over here. The fish isn't in the original painting, but the title of the painting was originally The Disintegration of the Persistence of Memory as Witnessed by the Chromosome of a Highly Colored Fish's Eye. And so there's a much larger title that Dali originally had for this painting, and it's essentially the fish becomes the witness to the end of the world. You know, that would be one very ambitious interpretation, but it's probably consistent. There's also this second element, which when you look at it, looks like there's a lot of bullets flying through the space, or maybe bombs, which would be an appropriate way to look at them. These actually are rhino horns. I think they're rhino horns intended to look like bombs, but Dali at this point is using rhino horns over and over again in his work. And in Nature for Mort Vivant, we saw that a rhino horn has a spiral shape to it, and in the way it grows. Dali's fascinated by that, and he's included many of them in this painting. So that even though he's talking about disintegration, he's talking about the dissolution of matter, he's constantly going back to this kind of underlying harmonious principle that can be found in nature, the way that the mathematical spiral seems to suggest some sort of cosmic presence in the universe. From the period of time when Dali was a surrealist all the way through the end of his career, he develops a particular shape that becomes his self-portrait. And it's basically, it looks like a face that's supported on its nose where the skull's been removed. In this painting, it would be this portion right over here that almost looks gelatinous. It looks transparent. It appears almost as an embryo in the original painting from 1931. And it's based on a particular rock that was very close to where Dali grew up, that he looked at all the time. That in the same way of looking at clouds and starting to see new forms, it was as if the rock showed a particular person's face supported on its nose. And for Dali, he starts to use that as a way of identifying himself. So in a sense, this is a self-portrait in this very peculiar landscape. And this painting is a very dramatic example of his use of single point perspective. And so he's trying to give you this incredibly distant vista through the way that he's created these lines. So it's like space is rushing out from under our feet into this very, very distant space that he's able to suggest by this really compressed use of the single point perspective. And the final thing just to note is that the way the skin is here on top of all of these figures, you can see there's just a little bit piercing out from the top. Dali has a great quote that he used in his career. He talks about his career is like an iceberg, of which only 1/10 of it is ever visible, thus requiring you to do research, to go down, to dig deep, to try to find out the true meaning underneath Dali's work. And you could say that in a way, this painting is alluding to that idea already in 1954. This is a painting called Nature Mort Vivant. It was painted in 1956. Dali was 52 years old, so about in the middle of his career, a little bit towards the second half of his career. And it's really the embodiment of a style that he embraces and describes himself as becoming, which is a nuclear mystical painter. So about 1950, 1949, Dali is ready to completely reinvent himself. He returns to Spain, and he, at this point, has embraced Catholicism, and he's starting to think about how mathematics and science were so essential to the Renaissance, to make the Renaissance such an incredibly great period of time for real advancement and ambitious achievement in the arts. So here we are in 1956. The bomb has been dropped. It's been 11 years since Hiroshima. And Dali is essentially reinventing himself and trying to come up with something ambitious that isn't just another painting, but rather a response to this new period of time that he's a part of. And so it's 1956, and he chooses for this painting to go back to another painting from the 1600s, a Baroque work called by Floris van Schooten, just called Still Life with Fruit. And what Dali has done is he's reinterpreted that original painting in relation to modern science. And the one particular idea that resonates with this work, which is rather complicated, but to try to keep it really as pristine and simple as possible, he was completely and totally fascinated by the idea that Dr. Heisenberg came up with, which is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And at its most basic level, it was the observation that on a subatomic level, a scientist can only observe either the velocity of a particle or its location, but they cannot observe the velocity and location simultaneously. And if you think about that in a daily world view, if you go to a baseball game, it's very easy to, at any point, find out the velocity of a baseball which has been thrown at any point between the pitcher and the batter. On the subatomic level, what Heisenberg was basically stating, this concept is that you can never establish that. In the process of looking at it, you isolate the way that you can read it. You can't see both simultaneously. So when we take the fruit and vegetables from the table, what Dali has done is he has basically thrown everything up into the air. And it's very much like a William Edgerton photograph, where Edgerton tried to capture with a camera the moment that something at a high velocity is happening. For example, a drop of milk into a surface of milk, creating a crown cornea, or a bullet passing through an apple, and capturing that moment of the explosion on such a small scale, which is too fast for the human eye to register. Dali basically creates his own Edgerton composition here, And he relates it to Heisenberg by giving us quite often two objects. One of those objects is going to be seen in space with a particular position. The other one has a velocity to it, and it's moving in space. So for example, we have two fruit dishes. This is actually the same fruit dish, but the fruit dish on the right-hand side is casting a shadow. It's very easy to read it. That one has location. The second fruit dish, which is actually basically disintegrating in a spiral formation, is a fruit dish that's dissolving with a certain velocity. It has no location and it casts no shadow. Dali also does the same thing with the apple. So the apple that should be inside of the fruit dish is both located in space, it has a particular position, it's casting a shadow, and then the second apple behind it is actually flying through space. It has no location, but it has velocity. One other particular scientific discovery that Dali became very excited about and became the first visual artist to comment on was the discovery or the proposition by Watson and Crick that the DNA molecule was structured as a spiral. And if you look over on the left-hand side, the banister to the outside balcony has this double helix spiral shape to it. This is the first time in visual arts that had ever been captured in any type of form in reference to the DNA molecule. And so Dali's basically creating a symbolic form to talk about scientific discovery, more or less creating a new renaissance that he wants to be the artist creating the visual images for. A couple other things on the upper left-hand side. There's a hand that's holding a rhino horn, which seems a bit strange in the middle of this composition. But actually, Dali was inspired to organize all of this information in a very highly mathematical way. And the rhino horn is actually created like a logarithmic spiral when it grows, more or less like an ear, like a sunflower or a nautilus shell. It has a very particular mathematical proportion related to the Fibonacci sequence. Dali loved that. He found it to almost be like the presence of some sort of divine organizing principle in the universe, and so he includes that in the composition. On the right-hand side, he includes another form that includes spirals. And at first, when you look at it, it almost looks like the top of a hydrogen bomb being exploded. It looks like we're looking at a mushroom cloud. I think that's deliberate, but what it is, it's actually a head of cauliflower. And inside of the head of cauliflower is a very, very tight and organized series of spirals related to the Fibonacci sequence and that proportional growing that Dali finds throughout nature and wants to reference in his paintings. There's a series of patterns here that came from the original painting that Dali has now basically let loose and let float into space. They're based on the Spanish cross. And down at the very bottom, Dali has included a number of very small particles of color that seem to be floating. And if you notice, the water is actually based on Botticelli's water in the Venus painting. At the very bottom, the water starts to break apart and fall off into little abstract particles. Dali basically alludes to modern art and his place in relation to modern art as choosing a different path, that he wasn't interested in abstraction, but rather a kind of hyper-realism. The one observation that you might make is that this painting seems, in many ways, very busy, very dense. It's filled with a lot of information, and it's somewhat hard to process it at first, but there is something about it that seems rather harmonious. The reason for that is because just shortly before this, just about 3 to 4 years prior to this, Dali had an opportunity to meet a mathematician named Matilagica. Matilagica had specialized in the mathematics involved with nature. Dali recognized the fact that there was a parallel between Leonardo da Vinci, when he was studying with Luca Pacioli, his mathematician, and what Dali was able to do with Matilagica. And so with this composition, as complicated and dense as it is, it's actually inspired by a design, the rectangle of the square root of 5, that Gica includes in his book on mathematics and the golden section. And if you look at this particular knife right in the center of the canvas, it corresponds with this line that dissects this pattern into 2 equal triangles. And the longer you start to study where the points of the inner rectangle are in relation to the convergences of these lines, those become points that Dali incorporates into the organization of his composition, so that it's very chaotic, and yet he's applied this very, very tight symmetry and order to the composition, so it still seems very harmonious, even though everything's exploding into space in all kinds of different directions. So we're in front of a painting here, which is called Gallici-Dalisi desoxyribonucleic acid. This was the largest one-word title Dali had created up until this point, and actually ever in his career. He was very proud of it because he was able to use wordplay to associate different ideas. His name, Dali, along with his wife's name, Gala, so Gallici-Dalisi. It also relates to El Cid, the hero, the folkloric hero of the medieval ages in Spain, and also related to Allah, the god of the Muslims, and of Arabic blood, which Dali was very fascinated with at this time. He actually felt that he had Arabic blood in his background. And it's a painting that really is fundamentally about a celebration of new concepts that have come up in science in relation to a particular tragedy. So there was a flood that happened in Barcelona in 1963. A number of people lost their lives. Right in the very dead center of this canvas, you can see the river that flooded. And what Dali has done is he created around this river a composition related to birth, death, and rebirth. So at the very top of the composition, you see the image of God the Father. He's reaching down. He's actually picking up his son, who at this point has been crucified, died, was buried, and is about to be taken up into heaven and given life again. So Dali is drawing on his Catholic beliefs and stories from the Bible. And you can see there's a wound on the side of Christ. His knees appear down here. Over on this side, this is his wrist. And his head is upside down. So he forms an arch around Dali's wife, Gala, who's looking on. But really the most important thing about this canvas in relation to the Artmobile and in relation to the study of science is that Dali chose to create two very interesting forms on either side of this composition. On the left-hand side, there's a series of connected small dots, small circles. And what that refers to is not only the proposition that the DNA molecule has a double spiral, double helix shape to it, but the fact that in 1963, Watson and Crick were actually given the Nobel Prize for their discovery. And so this is a DNA molecule, like the kind that they had proposed, that Dali has placed into his painting. And it's a molecule of life. And it's also the molecule of the persistence of genetic memory. Dali loved that idea, that he had come up with the idea of the persistence of memory. The DNA molecule is the persistence of genetic memory that allows us to look like our parents, to look like our grandparents, to have certain continuity. On the right-hand side, Dali has created an entirely opposing structure. You'll see there's a series of Arabic figures pointing guns at one another. The idea here is related to the Arab-Israeli war and the tension that was happening in the Middle East in the 1950s, 1960s. And it's structured in Dali's mind very much like a salt molecule. So a salt molecule is essentially like a crystal formation. It's inorganic matter. And if you think of it as, in particular as salt, you would salt the earth in order to kill life. So what Dali has done is he's created a life molecule, an anti-life or death molecule, and in the center we have Christ who's dead, who's about to be reborn. And so what Dali's doing is he's interweaving very skillfully his interest in Catholicism and also modern science, so that you have this really very unusual and interesting kind of synthesis into what Dali calls nuclear mysticism. One other detail to notice that also reinforces the story of life, death, and rebirth. In the upper left-hand side, there's a figure that's holding a banner. The title of the painting actually appears on this banner, almost like a scroll that's coming down from the heavens. The gentleman who's depicted there is the prophet Isaiah, and this comes from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. Prophet Isaiah foretold the birth of Christ. What we're witnessing here is the rebirth of Christ. So that idea of life, death, and rebirth continues and is reaffirmed through the image of the prophet Isaiah in the painting. So all of these different elements for Dali have to be woven together to create this one grand statement for the year to summarize what 1963, what his obsessions were during that particular time. So the painting that's behind me now is the Hallucinogenic Toreador. This is a painting that took Dali 16 months to create. It's perhaps the most ambitious of his large canvases. It's certainly the one that more or less ties together his entire career using a lot of different symbols that have been obsessing him since he was a child. It also offered for Dali a great opportunity to wrap up a lot of things before he devotes himself to making his museum, which he does between 1970 and 1974. So it was a painting where he decided to do something really great, something that would be of lasting importance, that would show his arrival as a great, great painter. And it was inspired by the most simple of inspiration. Dali was buying a box of pencils. On the side of the box of pencils was a Venus de Milo reproduction. He was looking at it. He started to see a face, and that became the kernel for this very, very large, ambitious canvas. He worked on it for 16 months, so it was not quite as quick as some of the previous paintings. And when you look at it, again, there's a lot of information, a lot of visual noise, and it's hard to see exactly what it is you're supposed to be looking at. But if you look right in the dead center, in the middle of all of these Venuses, and there's actually 31 Venus de Milos in this painting, but if you look in the dead center above the green shadow, there's a white button, and it's the white button of a bullfighter's shirt. And what happens is the green shadow suddenly becomes the tie of a bullfighter that he's wearing. He's wearing a white shirt, and you can see the collar, the triangular shape of the collar on both sides of the button. And when you start to move up into the Venus's body, you'll notice there's a shadow across the abdomen and across the belly. That becomes the chin and the lips of a bullfighter's face. Her breast becomes the bullfighter's nose. The shadow across her head becomes the right eye of the bullfighter. The left eye of the bullfighter is caught in the elbow of the next Venus. And the shadow on the side of the body of that Venus forms the contour of the side of the bullfighter's face. So just like we saw in old age, adolescence, and infancy, Dali has taken one particular arrangement or form of Venus de Milo, and he's been able to find within that a completely different composition. And here it's a great Spanish bullfighter. So he's brought these two very different and distinct ideas together in one configuration. There's also, off to the upper left-hand side, if you move 3 figures over from the left, you'll notice that there's a silhouette of a bullfighter. He's lifting up his cape, and he's devoting the bullfight to Dali's wife, who's in the very upper left-hand side. The yellow halo around him, if you look at it long enough, you'll realize it's the shape of a Venus. The Venus's face surrounds the cape that's being lifted up, so it's like a shadow across her face. And when you come down onto the arms and to his head, you'll notice the head is about where the breast would be. And it essentially, the yellow fills in the missing gap of the shape of a bullfighter. When you look at the 3 white Venuses down here at the bottom, if you just focus on the black shadow, it's exactly the same shape as that bullfighter lifting up his cape. So the shadow across the head becomes the cape the bullfighter's lifting up. The shadow on the outside and inside of the elbow are his arms. Underneath the breast is where the head is, and the rest of the body fits very loosely in that. And it's even repeated on the shadow on this red robe Venus, so that the shadow across the face is the bullfighter's cape that's being lifted up, the 2 arms, the head underneath the breast, and the rest of the body. So for Dali, this painting is really about metamorphosis, it's about transformation, it's about a kind of magic in the landscape around him, where things keep changing and transforming as he's looking at them. There's a number of other images. Some of them are hidden, some of them are transforming. One of the hidden images is right here in this area. At first, when you look at it, it looks like you're looking at a side of a cliff, and there's some water down here in the bay right below it. And the longer you look, you'll start to notice that there's 2 horns defined right here. These are actually the horns of a bull, and it's a very particular bull that gored a particular bullfighter in Spain. So this is essentially part of the theme of the story of the bullfighter, the hallucinogenic Toreador. Instead of a pool of blood, there's a pool of water. There's a woman on a raft down here, and she relates to the detail inside of his eye. Instead of seeing an eye, there's actually a fly that's there. And this goes back to a particular story from Dali's homeland. It was said that on 3 occasions, the French tried to come over the Pyrenees and conquer the area where Dali was from. And on each of these occasions, the crypt of a particular bishop, Saint Narciso, would open, and swarms of gadflies would come out, and they would drive back these invaders. So for the longest time, in this area that Dali's from, they celebrate a particular feast of the flies, where they celebrate the flies, and the fact of their independence is owed to this particular insect. And the whole theme of the Artmobile is Dali on the fly, Dali related to flies. You'll see flies down here at the bottom that are very realistic, which you'll see on the outside of the Artmobile. There's also flies suggested in metamorphosis and transformation with these little dots that are suddenly growing wings. There's flies at the very top that are decorating the hat of the bullfighter. It's even been proposed, and I'm convinced that this is actually a very astute observation, that the reason there's 31 Venuses here is because we're looking at a particular Venus de Milo from the perspective of a fly. And so the fly's faceted eyes would actually be seeing multiple Venuses while moving through space. And this is something that would have definitely appealed to Dali. He would love this type of idea. This painting is a combination of other art styles that influenced Dali. So you have realism in some of the details, like the rose and parts of the flies. There's also references to abstract art and the cubism down here at the very bottom, a reference to the artist Juan Gris. There's also a kind of psychedelic posterized version of the Venus's face up there on the upper left-hand side. There's optical art that's being experimented with in the middle of the body of the bull. And there's even down here a very specific reference to Life magazine, where there was a photograph in Life magazine of a Dalmatian. And it was basically a kind of Where's Waldo game, where the photographer, R.D. James, had tried to take a photo of a Dalmatian, overexpose it so that all you saw were the spots in a spotted space. Dali loved it so much, he copied it right into his composition. And so you'll look at the space, and it looks like the pattern of the water, but the longer you look at it, you'll start to see a form. And there's a leg back here on the right-hand side. There's sort of an underbelly that's suggested by that large rectangular brown area. There's a curve up here which forms the front haunches of the dog. And then the dog's head is on the left-hand side of those that curve, looking down with his ear flipped down. So he's basically drinking water, turning himself away from us. But the longer you look at it, suddenly you realize that there's a Dalmatian here that's hidden within this large and grand composition. And this is definitely the way that Dali approaches work. It's ambitious, but it's playful, it's sort of haunting, and it's suggesting that the world is constantly in flux when we least expect it. And again, for Dali as a Spaniard, this relates to the idea of the bullfight and the particular kind of tragedy that's at the center of that. Amongst all these details, right in the middle of this large bull, which has the fly for an eye, there's also a collection of round particles, round patterning, and brightly colored different dots that seem to be coming out at us. So again, science, art, and all of these things being brought to a particular synthesis in his work. There's references to friendship with Lorca, there's references to the Weaning and furniture nutrition, references to the bust of Voltaire. There's even, if you saw the paintings dealing with the Angelus, the shadow that's being cast by the Venus here is not another Venus shadow, but it's the shadow of the female Angelus that we saw that became the eye of the old man. You know, there was that female figure. That's what this shadow is right underneath the Venus here. And also he was influenced by Juan Gris when he was young. So all of this stuff relates to Dali's trajectory as an artist. We have talked about Dali's entire career. We've looked at this retrospective view of this particular artist. The reason this is also important is because Dali is such a perfect example of how a visual artist can become inspired by math, inspired by science, inspired by psychology, and look to their own personal life and their own personal experiences and draw from that and create something really great. And so here we have some of the tenets of STREAM, some of the key concepts about how other disciplines can interact with the visual arts. And really, fundamentally, I think it's the opportunity to see how your future students, who might be influenced, inspired, and changed by experiencing these ideas that Dali lives with from the beginning of his career all the way through the very end. And so hopefully you will take this forward, change a lot of the language, but find some really inspiring moments to share with your students. Thank you for watching.